My husband's fey servant held my wrists, while his iron collar bled onto my glove. Upstairs, my husband was laughing with my half-sister, the woman he had been sleeping with before he married me. I told the servant to stop, he released me, and I reached the door. Then I turned back and put his hand around me.
Again.
By morning, my husband had ordered the same servant I slept with to attend me personally. How long could we hide what happened beneath his own house? If you love forbidden desires, obsessed fey servants, and wives who take revenge, follow for more. Now, where were we? Chapter 1. The Door That Opened Twice. Wine from the fallen silver tray reached my wedding hem before I did anything about it. It moved slowly over the corridor stone, a dark red thread seeking the ivory silk. I watched it because the alternative was listening to my husband laugh behind the bridal chamber door. My left glove had torn at the thumb. I pinched the split seam together until the leather creased beneath my nail. Aed Silverthorn knelt beside the overturned tray. His silver blonde hair had fallen forward over one pale cheek, hiding most of his face. Candlelight caught the iron collar around his throat, and the pearls sewn into my veil with the same hard gleam. He had been carrying wine when I came out. I did not remember striking the tray, but there it was between us, one cup rolling in a small, bright circle until it settled. He lowered his eyes. Not in the exaggerated way servants did when they wanted their obedience noticed. He looked away from the loosened edge of my bodice, the crushed flowers at my wrist, and the wetness I had refused to let fall from my eyes. Behind the door, Bertram said something I could not make out. One of the women laughed, the other laughed after her, muffled by the painted fan she had held before her face. I could still see the room when I blinked, the untouched bed, Bertram's cream shirt open at the throat, wine shining on his lower lip, one woman seated against the pillows as though she had been waiting there for hours. The woman behind the fan had tapped its painted edge twice against her wrist and called me Linny. No one outside my family had used that name since I was a child. Bertram had looked from me to the women and smiled as if I were the final guest at a party arranged for my benefit.
Come in, wife. Marriage needn't be lonely unless you insist on being dull.
The woman on the bed had drawn one finger down his chest. The fan had trembled with another laugh. I had left before my face could do what they wanted. Now Ed rose with the tray balanced in one hand. He was tall enough that most men seemed coarsely made beside him, but the collar made even his graceful posture look temporary, something permitted rather than owned. A faint red-brown scar showed where iron met skin.
Where would you like me to take you?
His voice was quiet. He asked nothing about the room behind me, though everyone else in the house seemed eager to know how much I had seen.
Somewhere he cannot hear me.
Aed turned without glancing at the bridal chamber. I followed him past the public stair, through a narrow door covered in the same faded paper as the wall, and into a passage meant for servants carrying coal and chamber pots. My skirt brushed both sides. The house changed around us. Music and laughter became dull pressure behind plaster. He opened another concealed panel and led me into an unused winter parlor. The room smelled of cold stone and old upholstery. Faded blue chairs stood around a narrow hearth. The curtains had been tied back so neatly that the dust on them seemed arranged. Most important, the door had a lock on the inside. Ayed lit the fire. He poured water from a covered jug into a basin, placed a folded cloth beside it, and stopped at the threshold.
Will this do?
I touched the key in the lock.
Yes.
He waited. It took me a moment to understand that he would not enter fully unless I told him to. I had been a wife for less than an hour, and already a man owned by my husband offered me more control over a room than my marriage did.
Stay until the fire catches.
He stepped inside and closed the door without latching it. Then he knelt beyond arm's reach and fed thin wood to the flame. I removed my veil, 3 pins snagged in my chestnut hair. I pulled too hard and left one pearl hairpin bent in my palm. Aed's hands remained occupied with the fire.
You knew where to bring me.
There are few rooms Lord Grey does not use.
And this is one?
This is one he has forgotten.
I looked again at the tied curtains, the covered jug, and the cloth beside the basin. He had been keeping the room ready. When the fire held, he set the poker down.
Water is outside the door if you need more. The key turns cleanly. No bell connects this room to the servants' hall.
I wanted to ask why those were the details he had chosen. I wanted to know whether he had heard Bertram planning the evening, whether the women had come through the servants' entrance, whether everyone in the house had known except me. I asked none of it. Ayed inclined his head and left. Only after the latch settled did I cry. I pressed my folded veil against my mouth so no sound escaped, though Bertram was several walls away and laughing too loudly to hear me. At dawn, I washed my face in cold water and wrote to my father. I didn't describe the women's state of dress, the childhood name, or the way Bertram had invited me to share him as though he were offering sugared fruit. I stated that the marriage had not been entered in good faith and couldn't continue, then asked Lord Edmund Lovell to send a carriage and begin whatever arrangements were necessary to dissolve it. The sentences were so controlled, they might have concerned a damaged roof. I sealed the letter before I added what I had seen. In the service yard, mist clung to the cobbles. A messenger tucked the letter beneath his coat. Ayed stood by the stable door, holding a lantern, his pale gray-green eyes lowered, while the groom tightened the saddle straps. For one instant, he looked at the seal in the messenger's hand. Then he looked at me. There was no surprise in his face. I went upstairs, folded my veil into the trunk I had brought from home, and fastened every strap. I left the trunk beside my bedroom door. All morning I stepped around it, careful not to scuff the leather, because I still believed someone would come for me. Chapter 2. The Rooms She Could Not Close. My mother's reply arrived 4 days later, beside a pot of tea gone cold. The page was short enough to read before the wax, from the broken seal, hardened beneath my thumb. Lavinia, your father will not invite public ridicule by encouraging a bride to abandon her husband over private unpleasantness. You have been granted a titled marriage beyond what your birth might reasonably have promised. Learn to be happy in it. Do not mistake discomfort for catastrophe. There will be no dissolution and no return. Rosalind has moved into the south rooms. They suit her better now that you are established elsewhere. Your mother, Gertrude Lovell. The word mother looked almost indecent in her hand. I read the letter twice. On the third reading, I noticed a tea leaf stuck to the rim of my cup. I removed it with the tip of my spoon and placed it on the saucer. Then I unstrapped my trunks. I left the wedding trunk closed. The others I unpacked myself. Mist gray wool, powder blue silk, pale sage sleeves wrapped in linen. Each garment went into a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar and another woman's perfume. For 4 days I had stepped around the strapped trunks. I unpacked because no carriage was coming. Bertram had abandoned the manners of courtship with impressive speed. His manor filled each evening with cards, musicians, spilled wine, and people who spoke more freely after midnight than they would have dared in daylight. I was expected at dinner because a wife's absence created gossip. I was expected to ignore everything that happened afterward because a wife's attention created inconvenience. Aid removed the worst traces before morning whenever he could. A torn glove vanished from the stair. Perfume bottles disappeared from the east rooms. Once I came upon him carrying wine-stained sheets toward the laundry, his face perfectly blank and Bertram's signet impressed in red wax on a note tucked between them. He kept the writing turned inward and passed without apology. The east morning room finally defeated me. Guests had used it until dawn. Cards lay in the ash bucket. One of the rugs was soaked through with wine. A woman's stocking had been looped over the back of my chair, the pale silk torn at the knee. I called the steward and ordered the room cleaned, the liquor removed, and the door locked until the household returned to reasonable hours. For half a day the order stood. At dinner, Bertram pared a pear with his narrow silver-handled knife. He took the skin off in one unbroken curl, while the steward waited beside the table.
My wife has closed the morning room.
He said it to the guests as if sharing a diverting rumor. I kept my hands folded beside my plate.
The carpets require cleaning.
Then clean them.
He cut a white slice from the pear and held it out to Rosalind, who had arrived that afternoon to offer sisterly concern.
Doors close when I say they close.
Rosalind took the fruit from the knife point with her fingers. Her clear blue-green eyes flicked toward me, bright and satisfied. Bertram instructed the steward to reopen the room. Then he required me to receive the same gamblers there that evening. I refused to retract my order until he named the 2 maids and 1 footman who had obeyed me and said he could dismiss all 3 before dessert. He did not raise his voice. That was how I knew he would do it.
Open the room.
Bertram smiled at his pair. Later, Mistress Margaret Stanley found me in the linen passage. She was broad-shouldered, straight-backed, and so neatly arranged that even her worn oatmeal apron seemed to have authority. A heavy ring of keys rested at her waist. 1 old burn scar crossed the back of her right hand.
He forgives disobedience faster than embarrassment.
Margaret glanced toward the dining room, then waited for me to understand what my order had nearly cost.
I noticed.
Then notice who pays when you make him look small.
I had no answer. That night, Ayed appeared outside the supper room with a folded linen cloth over one arm.
Show me how not to be seen.
His eyes lifted to mine. He shifted the folded cloth on his arm and led me toward the hidden door. The servants' passages made a second house within the first. Narrow stairs rose beside chimneys. Panels opened behind tapestries. One corridor bent around Bertram's private rooms and came out near the laundry. Ayed showed me which boards complained underfoot and which doors had locks on only one side.
Who uses these?
Everyone who works here.
And everyone who doesn't wish to be seen working?
The corner of his mouth changed, not quite a smile. We passed behind the east morning room. Through the wall came the scrape of chairs and Bertram's laughter. I stopped. Ayed stopped with me. He stood close enough that the cold metal at his throat caught the light from my candle, but he did not touch me. A drunk guest stumbled into the public corridor beyond the next panel and began fumbling with the latch. Ayed shifted between the hidden door and me. His movement was slight, almost nothing. Yet I understood that if the panel opened, the guest would see him first. The latch rattled once and went still. We continued. When Ayed opened the winter parlor door, a candle was already burning on the mantel. The room held the same faint smell of banked coals and cold blue fabric as it had on my wedding night. The fire had not yet been lit, but kindling lay ready.
You prepared this.
I keep forgotten rooms from becoming unusable.
Do you?
His gaze rested on the candle between us. I hadn't told him I meant to come here. Until he opened the door, I hadn't told myself. I entered anyway and turned the key. Chapter 3. The Woman Behind the Fan. Rosalind kissed my cheek before Bertram's guests and called me poor darling. After that, she began visiting every week, honey blonde hair arranged without one loosened curl, and gowns brighter than mine. Peach silk one evening, pale gold the next, the painted fan always fastened to her wrist by a narrow ribbon. In private, she adjusted a lace cuff.
Bertram smiled at you twice, and you were ready to call it a marriage. You did the same whenever Father remembered you at supper.
Her clear blue-green gaze paused at the beauty mark beneath my left eye, as if it were dirt she had decided not to mention. She smoothed the lace again and waited for me to accept the correction. For several weeks, I blamed servants' gossip for what Rosalind knew. She knew which guests had stayed overnight. She knew Bertram preferred the blue chamber after drinking wine and the south rooms after brandy. She knew the phrase he had used on our wedding night about my learning to be amusing. I blamed Margaret first, then an indiscreet maid, then any route by which the words might have reached Rosalind without passing through her own guilt. Anything was preferable to placing another member of my family inside that locked room. During a crowded supper, Rosalind reached for Bertram's cup. Before he asked and drank from it, neither of them noticed. That was what made me follow her later. She slipped from the drawing room through the private stair beside Bertram's chambers, went straight to the panel, and lifted its warped edge with 2 fingers before the hinge could creak. I waited in the narrow darkness behind a hanging until my legs began to ache. When his chamber door finally opened, Rosalind stepped out, fastening the painted fan around her wrist. She closed it with a soft click. Then she tapped it twice against the inside of her wrist. The bridal chamber returned in one complete image. Bertram's wine-wet mouth, the untouched bed, the fan hiding a woman's smile, and that same small rhythm beneath the laughter. She had known that stare before I wore his ring. Rosalind paused at the stair. For one terrible moment, I thought she had seen me. She only smoothed the ribbon at her wrist and went down. I remained in the hidden passage until my candle burned low. If I stepped out, Rosalind would deny it, Bertram would laugh, and my mother would call me jealous. I stayed behind the hanging until Rosalind had gone. The winter parlor was warm when I reached it. Ayed sat near the hearth mending a split harness strap. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms, revealing faint pale abrasions at both wrists. He looked up once, saw my face, and set a cup of water within reach. No question. I sat in the chair from which I could see both doors. He returned to the leather. The needle passed through with a quiet pull. Fire settled in the grate. My hands stopped shaking before I noticed they had begun. I nearly told him. Rosalind's name reached my mouth and stopped. I drank the water instead. He drew the needle through leather and left the silence open. That night I dreamed of him without the collar. He sat in the winter parlor chair, pale hair loose over his shoulders, and the skin at his throat unbroken. I knelt between his knees in my nightdress, my hands resting open on his thighs.
Come closer.
I obeyed. His hand settled at the back of my neck. My shoulders loosened beneath it. When I woke, the room was dark, and my bedroom hearth had gone cold. The smell of banked coals and winter stone lay on my pillow. My door was locked from the inside. I listened for footsteps in the corridor. There were none. The next day I avoided Ayed so thoroughly that I took the public stair twice and endured Bertram's guests rather than pass through the service hall. The next day, Ayed placed a plate near me at dinner, opened a door, and removed an empty glass before Bertram could knock it onto my skirt. His fingers never touched mine. By evening, I was aware of every place on my body where they had not. Chapter 4. The Rule She Made Belowstairs. After the dream, I began going to the winter parlor for reasons that had nothing to do with fire. Ayed mended harness leather there because the light was better than in the tack room, polished silver, or sat on the rug against the blue settee while I read the same page for half an hour. If I had missed a meal, bread and sliced pear appeared beside my chair. When my hand shook, he set the cup where I could lift it with both of them. The chair facing both doors remained mine, even when it was the coldest place in the room. He asked for nothing. I began wanting the room because of it. Because I distrusted appetites, I made a rule.
You must never send for me.
Ayed was threading a needle through a torn leather strap. He did not look up.
No,
I frowned.
No?
I will not send for you.
His agreement came so easily that I wanted to test it.
If I don't come,
Then you don't come.
and you won't wait?
At that, his eyes lifted. The silver ring around each pale iris caught the firelight.
I didn't say that.
The answer unsettled me more than flattery would have. 3 nights later, Bertram seated Rosalind in the wife's place. No announcement was needed. He pulled out the chair at his right before I reached it and laid one hand across its carved back while she sat. The guests observed the arrangement with the concentrated indifference of people eager to remember every detail. My place setting had been moved farther down the table. Bertram watched me notice.
My wife has no appetite tonight. She has always preferred to be hungry where everyone can admire it.
The guests laughed with him. I left before the final course. Bertram owned the house, the wine, the servants, the chair beside him, and the fey man his guests treated as decoration. I kept calling what I meant to do, revenge as I went below stairs. Rain struck the small cellar windows. Flour dust whitened the servants' corridor, outside a disused workroom, and a low lamp burned within. I was still wearing the ivory gown Bertram had mocked at dinner, its pearl buttons fastening the fitted silk down my back. Ayed stood at a work table with his sleeves rolled and his dove-gray waistcoat unfastened. The soft collar of his cream shirt had fallen open enough to expose the rough iron ring and the red-brown skin beneath it. He looked as though he had expected no one. I closed the door. He set down the cloth in his hand.
My lady,
Don't call me that.
what would you prefer?
I removed my gloves, one finger at a time, and laid them on the table. I had prepared no answer, so I crossed the room, took his face between my hands, and kissed him. Ayed received the kiss without answering it. His mouth was warm, his hands hung open at his sides, as if I had given an order he didn't yet understand. The stillness felt like refusal. I caught one of his hands and placed it at my waist. His fingers closed over the fitted silk of my bodice. Only then did he kiss me back. Every trace of restraint gathered into a frightening concentration. One hand stayed at my waist, while the other rose to the side of my neck, not holding, only feeling the place where my pulse had begun to race. I pulled away first.
Would you do this because I outrank you?
Ayed's hand left me. He stepped back. The cold between our bodies arrived so quickly that I hated him for it.
Tell me to leave.
Answer me first.
You are aware that my tongue is equally held hostage.
He stepped aside until nothing blocked the latch. I could have taken it.
Don't.
Then I closed the distance myself and pulled him back by his neckcloth. The second kiss struck harder. His hand returned to my waist with enough force to make the stays beneath my bodice press into my ribs. My back met the door. His mouth moved from mine to the angle beneath my jaw. My fingers opened the top of his shirt. Iron scraped damaged skin. Ayed flinched.
Stop.
He released me at once. No offended pause, no reluctance arranged, so I would praise his control. One moment his body held mine against the door. The next there was air between us, and his hands were open at his sides. Rain filled the room. I reached for the latch. My fingers rested on the cold metal. Ayed said nothing behind me. My hand stayed on the latch. Behind me, Ayed waited. I could hear my own breathing. I turned. He was where I had left him. I crossed the room, took his hand, and placed it back at my waist.
Again.
Relief crossed his face before he mastered it, and that frightened me more than triumph would have. He lifted me onto the edge of the work table. The movement was effortless. I had thought his build delicate because he was lean, but there was controlled strength in the long line of his arms and shoulders. He stood between my knees and waited until I pulled him closer. After that, he stopped waiting for me to choose each small movement. His hand settled at the back of my neck and turned my face where he wanted it. Pearl hooks yielded beneath his fingers. Silk slipped from one shoulder. When I caught his sleeve and drew him between my knees, he lifted my skirts and held me steady against the work table, strong enough that its edge knocked once against the wall. Above us, someone laughed. My whole body locked. Ayed stopped with me as the laughter came again through the floorboards. For one sick instant, I was back in the bridal chamber, pearls at my throat and Bertram watching to see whether I would break. Ayed began to move away. I caught his wrist and pulled his palm over my mouth. His gaze sharpened. His hand stayed where I placed it. His other arm closed around my waist, and when he drew me nearer, the work table shifted against the stone. The laughter thinned to noise beyond a locked door. My grip failed. I pressed my face into his shoulder, and when the shaking worsened, I held on harder. Ayed said nothing. He kept me close until the worst of the shaking passed. By the time the rain softened, my skirts were crushed. My bodice hung open at the back. His shirt was rumpled around the collar, and one pearl button lay somewhere beneath the work table. A thin line of blood marked the edge of the iron. It had smeared across one ivory glove where it rested near his shirt. I dressed without looking at him. My fingers would not reach the lowest hook of my bodice. Ayed knelt behind me. He knelt and fastened the last hook. His fingertips lingered once against my spine. I took the blood-marked glove and hid it inside my sleeve. I left before dawn. Only in my bedroom did I notice the missing pearl button. Chapter 5. What he gave her when she came. I kept my rule. Ayed never sent for me. The rule only drove the affair into sleep. The dreams learned its shape and stepped around it. On nights I resolved not to visit, I dreamed of the winter parlor fire. Sometimes Ayed knelt before me while I told him where to put his hands. Sometimes I knelt and listened while he gave me one quiet instruction after another. The balance changed, the relief did not. Each dream ended with his fingers against the iron collar.
Do you want me free?
He never asked the question aloud when I was awake. I stayed away for 5 days. The manor grew louder, sleep thinned until every door made me open my eyes. I began listening for Aed's footsteps in corridors he had no reason to enter. When he passed me in public, his face remained composed and his hands did not reach. By the 6th night, I was listening for him and resenting every corridor that stayed empty. On the 6th night, I went to the winter parlor and locked the door harder than I needed to. He was sitting on the rug beside the hearth polishing a silver salver. He put it aside when I locked the door.
Kneel.
He did.
Take off my shoes.
Aed rested one hand beneath my ankle and slipped the pale leather shoe free, then the other. His head remained bowed, silver blonde hair grazing my skirt.
Wait.
He waited. I directed everything. Where he touched, when he looked at me, how long his hand remained at my calf before moving higher beneath the fall of my skirt. He obeyed without making obedience into theater. For a few minutes I believed control might restore something.
Tell me I was not foolish.
Aed's hands went still.
For believing Bertram.
He raised his face.
He meant you to believe him.
I looked away. My command voice failed. I sat on the rug because my knees wouldn't keep me upright. Aed remained kneeling and waited until I reached for him. Nothing else happened. My clothing stayed loosened. His forehead rested against my knee, and my fingers caught in his pale hair while I cried without sound. I had wanted Bertram to choose me. I kept my face turned away from Aed until the crying stopped. I left through the hidden panel before dawn, carrying my shoes in one hand. Roslyn stood at the far end of the service stair. Her hair had loosened around her face. The painted fan hung from her wrist. She looked at my bare feet, my unpinned hair, and the panel closing behind me. I looked at the fan. Neither of us spoke. Later, Bertram asked why she had been near the service stair. Roslyn told him his wife had begun wandering below stairs at night. By evening, servants were being questioned, locks were being checked, and Bertram had begun appearing in corridors he usually ignored. I stayed away from Aed again. This time I counted the hours by what was missing. Sleep, quiet, the pressure of his hand. On the 4th sleepless night, I found him in the winter parlor and could not keep my hands steady long enough to turn the key on the first try.
I don't want to decide anything.
Aed stood by the hearth. Only the muscles beside his mouth tightened.
Are you asking me to choose?
I nodded.
For tonight.
He crossed the room and locked the door himself. The key turned, I watched his hand, and stayed where I was. Aed removed my hairpins one by one. He placed them in a straight line on the floorboards. When my chestnut hair fell loose down my back, he put one hand at my nape and told me where to stand.
Near the fire.
I obeyed.
Look at me.
I did.
Be still.
The quiet command carried cleanly across the room. He turned me by the shoulders, moved my hands where he wanted them, and held my wrists together in one of his. The other rested at the back of my neck. I pulled once against his hand. Nothing moved. After that, I could think only about breathing. There was no Rosalind, no Bertram, no mother's letter folded at the bottom of a drawer. There was only the pressure of Aed's hand, the heat of the fire against one side of my face, and his instruction to breathe. When the emptiness in my mind became too complete,
Aed!
My voice broke on his name. He released my wrists at once. The room returned around me, fire, blue upholstery, hairpins on the floor. Aed waited. The latch was behind me. I took his hand and placed it back around my wrists. His eyes closed for one brief moment. Then he resumed, slower at first, until I leaned into the certainty of him. He kept my wrists in one hand while the other loosened my gown, moved me nearer the fire, and held me where he had placed me when my legs began to shake. The remembered laughter disappeared. His command to breathe became the only rhythm I could hear. Afterward, I slept against his chest on the rug. His collar had shifted without bleeding, and 2 fingers rested over my pulse, as if sleep were another condition he meant to measure. I watched them until my eyes closed again. Over the next fortnight, the winter parlor kept several versions of us. One night, because I asked him to choose again, he stood me against the locked door and took every small decision from me until my knees failed. Another night, I arrived too tired for anything but the bread he tore into pieces and the shelter of his body on the rug. Once I woke before dawn beneath his blanket, wearing his cream shirt while he repaired the lowest pearl hook of my gown. His fingers always returned to my pulse. My mother had used the word happy in her letter, so I refused it here. Even so, while Ayed held me, I stopped checking the door. Margaret returned the missing pearl the next morning. She found me in the still room and placed it in my palm. Her rough fingertips closed my fingers around it.
I haven't asked where this came from.
No.
I'm not asking now.
The pearl was small and warm from her hand.
If Lord Grey learns whose room you were leaving, he'll shame you before the house and punish Silverthorn.
I know.
Margaret checked the passage.
You know what he does to you. You haven't seen what he does to a bound fae.
She left without waiting for an answer. I sewed the pearl back onto the ivory gown myself. The thread pulled too tight on one side, leaving the button slightly crooked. I considered cutting it loose and beginning again, then left it as it was. At dinner, Bertram's jokes no longer made my hands tighten beneath the table. Rosalind noticed. Her fan moved faster whenever I kept my face still. Bertram noticed something else. Ayed began anticipating my needs before I spoke. Water appeared when I set down wine. A chair was moved before smoke reached my side of the table. Once, when a guest leaned too close, Ayed stepped forward with a tray at precisely the moment needed to force him back. Bertram watched from across the table, his amber brown eyes half-lidded with amusement.
At tomorrow's dinner, Silverthorn will serve my wife personally.
The room went quiet for less than a breath. Rosalind looked at me. Ayed lowered his eyes. Bertram smiled as though he had placed a blade on the table and was waiting to see who reached for it.
Chapter 6. Before the wedding, he had already chosen. I first saw Lavinia Lovell in the rain. Months before she entered Bertram's house in wedding silk, Hugh Blunt held my chain too short in the market and jerked it whenever the iron made me slow. The collar suppressed glamour. It did not suppress pain. That was one of the reasons humans favored it. Hugh had ordered me to carry 2 parcels, Bertram's cloak and a crate of wine bottles through a crowd narrowed by mud. When I stumbled, he pulled the chain until the iron cut old scar tissue and told the watching vendors that Faye only learned grace after enough correction. Most people looked away. Lavinia held Hugh's gaze. She wore a muted storm blue gown beneath a traveling cloak, with dark chestnut hair escaping near her temples. We were strangers, and she wasted no breath on a speech. She stepped between Hugh and the wine merchant.
Is Lord Grey's account paid?
Hugh turned to answer because the question made him look negligent in public. His grip loosened. I regained my footing. Lavinia waited until I had the crate balanced. Then she left. She left without touching me, asking my name, or waiting for gratitude. The bond recognized her before I could decide whether I wanted recognition. It struck through iron with such certainty that the market vanished for one heartbeat. I knew the line of her body in a crowd. I knew the place her presence occupied in the world. I knew that if she walked away, every part of me capable of movement would follow. The binding stopped in tension before it became action. I remained beside Hugh. Lavinia forgot me. Bertram noticed her later for reasons unrelated to mine. Lord Edmund Lovell's illegitimate daughter came with enough settlement to steady a careless estate and too little family protection to become troublesome. Bertram liked the thought of a wife who would thank him for public recognition. On the first visit to the Lovell house, Edmund kept us in his library beside a stack of unpaid accounts. He named Bertram's poor income, the household's reputation, the embarrassment likely to follow the match. I stood behind Bertram's chair and poured wine.
Settled income.
Bertram tapped one account with his glove.
A practical joining.
Edmund refused him. On the second visit, I set the wine beside Edmund's hand while he studied the same columns and repeated Bertram's figure when asked. I laid no new desire in him. I only let the practical phrase remain after the rest of the conversation thinned. By the third visit, Edmund called the match sensible in his own voice and seemed relieved to be done objecting. Gertrude needed no glamour. Removing Lavinia from the Lovell house already pleased her. Rosalind needed none either. Her affair with Bertram and the pleasure she took in her sister's displacement belonged to her. Bertram summoned me to his writing room one evening. A draft of his courtship letter lay beside a dying candle. He turned the quill between his fingers and asked what an unwanted woman might mistake for love.
Tell her you choose her despite what the world has failed to see.
He smiled, bent over the page, and improved the penmanship without improving the feeling. Later I saw the folded letter beneath Lavinia's glove, held against the front of her traveling cloak. On the wedding afternoon, I aired the winter parlor. I drew the curtains, covered a jug of water, folded a cloth beside the basin, and tested the inside lock twice. Before the bridal chamber opened, a candle was already waiting on the mantel. After Rosalind's betrayal, iron kept me on the servant's stair outside Lavinia's locked room. I closed my eyes and sent one careful image through the bond. My throat bare, her knees between mine. Surrender made separate from ridicule. Nothing more. Her answer came back as relief, shame, and want so closely joined that I nearly broke the dream. I couldn't tell what had begun in her and what I had strengthened. I still can't. After that, I kept the latch clear. At the first word, I let go. When she crossed the room and put my hand back, I trusted the return more than the dream. I also knew each return made the rest of her life harder to bear without me. The binding understood intention. I could carry Bertram's silver-handled knife to his table, but if I imagined turning it against him, my fingers opened before the thought became movement. Poison stopped at the same threshold. Even arranging another man's hand against him tightened the collar until I couldn't breathe. The collar stayed loose when I prepared a forgotten room, repeated a practical phrase to a tired father, or sent a dream through the mate bond. Her rage was already hers. So was the hand that could reach Bertram. I could not kill my master. My mate could. The memory ended beneath candlelight. Bertram's fingers curled under the iron at my throat while Lavinia watched from the far side of the dinner table.
Chapter 7, The Blood Beneath the Iron. Aid knelt beside my chair with a crystal decanter balanced in one hand. Bertram had arranged the dinner beneath too many candles. Wax softened in silver branches. The guests shone with jewels and wine. Aed's pale slate service jacket had been fitted close across his shoulders, and the iron collar looked darker against the clean cream of his shirt. He poured for me without lifting his eyes. A woman across the table remarked that lonely wives developed unusual tastes. A man beside her wondered whether servants could be trained to anticipate them. The laughter was restrained enough to be called civilized. Rosalind did not watch Aed. She watched me. Bertram continued discussing a horse he meant to purchase. In the middle of a sentence, he leaned back and hooked 2 fingers beneath Aed's collar. He tightened it by degrees. Aed remained kneeling. The decanter stayed level at first, then the muscles in his hand tightened. Wine trembled inside the crystal neck. His expression held. A fine tremor entered his wrist. Bertram asked one of the guests whether the bay mare was worth breeding. Aed's pouring hand shook. One red drop struck the white tablecloth. A second stain appeared at the edge of the collar. Blood, not wine.
Release him.
The room stilled. Bertram's gaze moved to me. His fingers remained beneath the iron.
What was that?
Release him.
Bertram smiled. He tightened the collar once more, enough to draw a visible line of blood, then let go. Ayed kept his gaze on the blood-spotted tablecloth.
Leave the decanter.
Ayed set it down with perfect care and rose. One drop of blood traveled beneath his collar into the open edge of his shirt.
Go.
He went. Bertram returned to the horse as though nothing had happened. I lasted until the next course. Ayed was in the winter parlor, sitting outside the circle of firelight. He had removed the service jacket. His hands rested on his knees. They shook once when I entered, then became still.
Do not come closer.
I locked the door.
You are bleeding.
You should not have spoken.
I removed my pearl drop earrings and placed them on the mantel. Then the thin silver chain from my throat, then my bracelet. Precious metal had never looked so ugly as it did, beside the iron cutting into him.
You were bleeding.
I took the old glove from where I kept it folded inside my pocket. The outer side still carried the dark, faint smear from our first night below stairs. I turned it and pressed the clean inner fold beneath the collar. Ayed caught my wrist. His fingers closed just enough to stop me.
He knows.
He suspects.
He knows enough.
Old blood and new darkened the same ivory cloth. I touched the back of his hand until his fingers loosened. Then I cleaned the raw ring beneath the iron as well as I could without opening what could not be opened. He watched my face, not my hands, my face. When I bent and pressed my mouth to the wounded skin below the collar, his breath left him unevenly. I kept my lips there until salt and metal coated my tongue.
Bertram will not keep you forever.
Ayed closed his eyes. His jaw tightened, and I took it for hope. Rosalind asked to see me privately the next afternoon. She waited in the east morning room, the room I had once tried to close. The carpets had been cleaned, but a pale wine stain remained beneath the window. Settlement papers lay on the table. Rosalind wore powder blue silk, and the painted fan at her wrist. Her usual polish had tightened around her mouth.
You must go before the grand party.
Must I?
Bertram is asking questions about the service passages. He has begun wondering whether I encouraged you.
Did you?
Her gaze sharpened.
This is not the time to be clever.
The agreement allowed me to leave if I surrendered the remainder of my settlement, accepted public blame for desertion, and promised not to return. Bertram would retain the money. Rosalind would retain him. My family would retain its reputation. I would leave with no home, no settlement, and blame fixed to my name.
Sign. Take the North Road before he changes the terms.
I turned one page without reading it.
Does Aid come with me?
Rosalind went still.
The agreement concerns you. Do not make it concern him.
Then it does not concern me either.
Her hand flattened on the table.
Lavinia, listen. Bertram has been asking what an iron-bound fae would fetch from a northern buyer.
The fan ribbon slipped against her wrist. For the first time since the wedding, her composure broke.
I thought he meant to frighten you. He has started writing to them.
To whom?
An iron master, one who reforges collars.
She looked toward the door before lowering her voice.
They remove whatever remains of disobedience.
The fear in her face was real. So was the calculation behind the papers.
You let Bertram see you cared for him. Go before he uses that.
You were near me first.
Her mouth tightened. I left the papers unsigned. In the winter parlor, I fed them one sheet at a time into the coals. The edges curled, ink blistered and vanished. The room smelled of scorched sealing wax. Ayed entered after the final page collapsed. I put my palm against the iron collar. He looked at the ash in the grate, then covered my hand with his. Chapter 8. The Key Torn from Her Nightdress. After I burned Rosalind's settlement papers, I stopped drinking wine. Bertram's guests called me pious while I drank water at dinner and watched every cup poured. Sobriety seemed the simplest way to obtain one clean answer about my own mind. It didn't help. The laughter followed me after the rooms emptied, a woman's quick breath behind a fan, Bertram's lower amusement beneath it. Soon it moved through servants' passages where no guests had been. I turned a corner and heard it ahead of me. When I retraced my steps, it came from behind. Time went missing with it. A candle burned lower than it should have. A fastened latch stood open. Mud marked the hem of a gown I hadn't worn outside, and soot returned beneath my fingernails after I avoided every hearth for 2 days. The first time Ayed placed 2 fingers over my pulse and silenced the sound, I gripped his wrist before he could withdraw. After that, I reached for him whenever the laughter rose. Under his hand, I could hear ordinary things again. Wood settling, rain against glass, my own breathing. Then I pictured Bertram's chair empty, his room still, and Ayed bare-throated in morning light. My fingers loosened around Ayed's wrist. Margaret found me barefoot near the laundry stair before dawn. Soot marked my nails. I asked why she was awake, and after she answered, I asked again. She took my elbow and led me to my room without discussing it. That afternoon, she opened my wardrobe, pushed aside 2 gowns, and showed me a stable cloak folded behind them. A small purse of coins lay beneath it. So did a service gate key. Her key ring at her waist had an empty place.
Use them before the party.
Come with me.
No.
Help, aid, leave.
Margaret's dark eyes held mine.
I don't know what the iron lets him do.
I can open one gate. Take it while it still opens.
I won't leave him.
Then the key won't help you.
Margaret folded the wardrobe door shut. I waited until night and built a test. I locked my bedroom door. I sewed the key into an inner pocket of my nightdress with black thread, pulling each stitch tight enough to leave a ridge beneath my thumb. I sprinkled flour across the threshold. I tied a small brass bell to the latch. Then I placed a chair beneath the handle and slept with the curtains open to moonlight. I woke outside Bertram's chamber. My feet were bare on the cold boards. Flour whitened the soles. The key was clenched in my fist. Black thread clung beneath 2 fingernails. My other hand rested on Bertram's latch. Ayed stood behind me, his hand closed over mine before I could press down. I spun toward him. For the first time since I had known him, fear showed plainly on his face. His breath caught. His fingers tightened around my wrist.
Did you bring me here?
He said nothing. The laughter swelled behind my eyes. Ayed reached for me.
Don't.
He stopped. His hands fell to his sides. I stepped back until my shoulder struck the wall. The laughter kept rising, and I still knew exactly how far away he stood. The laughter became unbearable. I caught his wrist and pressed my palm over his pulse. The beat beneath my hand was slow, too slow for the fear I had seen. The sound receded. My hand remained over his pulse after the laughter stopped.
What was I doing?
Ayed looked at Bertram's closed door.
Trying to make it stop.
He guided me back through the servants' passage without touching me again. Inside my room, the chair had been moved. The door was closed but not locked. One trail crossed the flour from bed to threshold. The black thread pocket had been torn open. My missing stocking was wrapped around the bell, muffling it. I had unlocked the door, silenced the warning, crossed the house, and closed the door behind me. I had attempted to leave no proof and failed only because some part of me had not remembered the flour on my feet. Every mark belonged to my own hands and feet. For several nights, I didn't sleep beside Ayed or enter the winter parlor. When he appeared in public, I looked at the collar rather than his face. The service gate key remained beneath the stable cloak. I took it out once and held it against my palm until its teeth left marks. Then I put it back. I could not use the road if Ayed remained behind. Chapter 9. The Caller at Dawn. The grand party began before sunset. Musicians occupied the gallery. Gaming tables appeared in the drawing room. Bertram's guests filled the corridors in silk, velvet, perfume, and the loose confidence of people who expected servants to remove every consequence by morning. Rosalind received them beside him. She wore pale gold, her honey blonde hair arranged high, the painted fan hanging closed from her wrist. From a distance they looked married. Bertram with one hand at her back, Rosalind remembering each guest's name, both of them standing where the lord and lady of the house should have stood. I entered in the same ivory gown I had worn the first night I went below stairs. The pearl I had repaired sat crooked near the edge of my bodice. The old blood-marked glove was folded inside my sleeve. Rosalind's gaze found the pearl first, then she looked at my face, waiting for me to see her in my place. I looked past her to the musicians. Her fan opened too quickly. Bertram called me into the center of the room after the musicians finished their second piece. He held a pear in one hand, and his slim, silver-handled knife in the other. The peel fell in a curling strip toward the carpet.
My wife has developed a fondness for hidden corridors.
The nearest guest turned toward me with bright, expectant faces. Rosalind opened her fan. Bertram cut a slice from the pear.
My dear Rosalind reports seeing her emerge from the servants' stair at an hour when respectable wives generally remain in bed.
Rosalind's fan stopped moving.
You asked why I was near the stair. I told you what I saw.
To protect yourself.
Her eyes met mine over the painted silk. The fan closed once between her fingers. Bertram ate the pear slice from the knife.
Whatever her motive, the result is useful.
He lifted 2 fingers. Ayed stepped forward from the wall. His service jacket concealed most of the wound, but the collar's edge was dark, where it had cut him days before. He stopped beside Bertram and lowered his eyes.
At dawn, Silverthorn goes north.
A woman near the mantel stopped in the middle of a whisper, and someone set down a glass hard enough to ring.
To a man who understands iron better than I do, a reforged collar may cure this household of all its little misunderstandings.
Until the buyer left, Bertram explained, I would be confined to the upper rooms. He spoke lightly, as though arranging sleeping quarters for inconvenient guests. Dawn left no time to wait. Rosalind caught my sleeve. Her fingers closed around the fabric before she seemed aware she had moved.
Do not give him another reason.
Bertram heard. He laughed.
Concern does not suit you, Ross.
You said you would send him away.
Her voice remained low.
Not there.
The fan trembled once at her wrist. She still had not let go of my sleeve. Bertram placed the pear on a tray.
My wife forgets that the rooms, the servants, and the man she visited below stairs all belong to me.
He smiled with the same easy mouth that had written letters about choosing me against the world.
You were never the bride, darling. You were the dowry.
Rosalind did not laugh at once. The others did. The laughter struck the same place it had on my wedding night. My hand went to the crooked pearl. Bertram set the silver-handled knife beside his wine. I thought of Dawn. Ayed kept his eyes lowered. When the musicians began again and the guests turned toward them, I moved past Bertram's abandoned glass. My hand closed around the knife. I wrapped it inside the old glove and hid it along my forearm beneath my sleeve. Then I left through the servants' passage I had once asked Ayed to teach me. In a service cupboard near the upper hall, I found lamp oil. I took 1 small flask and a brass taper holder. Bertram's chamber was empty. I entered through the hidden panel. I poured a narrow line of oil along the bed curtains and over the edge of the rug nearest the hearth. The fabric darkened where it soaked in. I lit the taper at a wall candle and sheltered it outside the chamber door, where the draft would not extinguish it. Then I waited. My hands began to shake only after the room was ready. Bertram arrived long after midnight, drunk and pleased with himself. Carrying a half-empty glass of wine, he closed the door, set the glass on the small table beside the bed, and found me waiting.
There you are.
He loosened one cuff.
Have you come to plead for my Faye?
I said nothing.
Or to confess what you did with him?
The knife lay flat against the inside of my arm. Bertram moved closer. His open collar showed the smooth, golden skin of a man whose body had never been treated as property.
Say his name. I want to hear how my wife asks for something that belongs to me.
I drew the knife. He caught my wrist. His grip crushed my wrist. He yanked me toward him without looking at the blade hidden along my arm. He pulled me sharply toward him. I had concealed the blade along my forearm with its point angled inward. His own force drove it beneath his ribs. For one stunned instant, neither of us moved. His amber-brown eyes widened. Wine soured on his breath. Then his weight folded forward against my shoulder. His grip weakened. I twisted free and kept hold of the knife. He tried to speak my name. It came out wet and disbelieving. I struck again before he could recover his breath or balance. The second wound took the strength from his legs. He fell against the bed, dragging one curtain half down with him. His shoulder struck the small table. The wineglass tipped, broke against the floor, and spread beneath my bracing hand as his fingers closed around my skirt.
Aid!
The party sounds vanished. Bertram's mouth moved again, but no sound came. His hand slipped from my skirt and stopped moving. Bertram's last breath stopped. The knife handle slid in my palm. Wine cooled under my hand, and the crooked pearl dug into my skin. I stepped into the corridor and took the prepared taper. Then I dropped it into the oiled curtain hem. Fire traveled exactly where I had taught it to go. The first flame climbed the fabric in a thin orange line. The second took the rug. By the time smoke reached the ceiling, the room had begun to speak again in cracks and rushing air. The hidden panel opened before anyone reached the public door. Ayed arrived first. He looked from Bertram's body to the fire and then to me. He took the knife from my hand gently. Behind him, iron clicked. The collar opened at its seam. It struck the floor once. That sound remained clearer than Bertram's final breath. Ayed stood before me with his wounded throat bare. For the first time, nothing in the world compelled him to kneel. Chapter 10. The Road He Chose. The fire alarm began below us. A bell rang through the manor. Doors opened. Guests shouted in the corridors, still more offended than afraid, because they did not yet understand whose chamber burned. I looked at the collar on the floor, then at Ayed's calm face. The murder and his freedom fitted together too perfectly. He reached for me. I pulled my hand away and held it against my own chest.
Did you bring me into this house?
Smoke moved along the ceiling behind him.
Right.
The word was quiet and complete.
The dreams?
I sent them.
Did you make me kill him?
Ayed didn't answer. His eyes moved to the open collar on the floor. The heat strengthened. Somewhere beyond the wall, glass broke. I stepped toward the door.
Do not touch me.
Ayed's breath caught. Fear showed plainly on his face. He moved between me and the burning corridor.
Move.
Smoke pushed beneath the door. When I tried to pass, he caught my upper arms. One hand twisted the torn cuff of my gown. The scent of smoke entered the winter-clean smell I had associated with him for months.
Do not touch me.
I will not leave you for them.
I said move.
His grip tightened. Then he placed his forehead against mine. Cold moved through me. Cold loosened my limbs before sleep reached me. The bell became distant. My knees failed, and Ayed caught me before I struck the floor. I tried to turn my face away before my eyes closed. The last thing I saw in Bertram's chamber was the collar lying open beside my blood-stained hem. I woke in fragments, cold air. Ayed carrying me through the servants' yard, his bare throat above me, red-brown scar tissue raw where the iron had been. Margaret at the service gate, one hand on her key ring and the other fitting the stolen key into the lock. Margaret looked from my slack face to the raw skin at Ayed's throat. Her hand paused on the key.
West Wing!
She shouted to two servants running through the smoke.
There are people trapped by the west stair.
They turned away from us. Margaret opened the gate. Her master key was missing from its ring. She turned back toward the manor and seized the fire bell rope with her scarred hand. The bell followed us into the fog. Ayed laid me beneath the stable cloak in a cart and covered it with a rough blanket. Wheels jolted over the yard stones. Through half-closed eyes, I saw figures spilling from the house. Powdered faces streaked with soot, fine clothing torn by panic. Fire glowed behind the upper windows. Rosalind reached the courtyard. Her hair had fallen from its pins. The painted fan was gone. She turned toward the smoke and called my name once.
Lavinia!
The sound came close enough to touch and passed behind us. The cart went through the gate. Glamour softened the eyes of those who looked our way. Their gazes slid over Aed's pale hair, the bundled shape beside him, and the blood at my cuff, as though we were only another servant taking supplies from the fire. When I woke fully, the manor had become orange light behind fog. The cartwheels struck deep ruts. Aed held the reins in both hands. Without the collar, his neck looked longer and strangely unguarded, though his posture remained exact. He glanced back when I pushed the blanket down.
Is Bertram dead?
Aed took one hand from the reins and lifted mine. He examined the blood at my torn cuff. Instead of answering, I pulled weakly. His fingers remained closed around mine.
Where are we going?
He looked toward the road. Ahead it divided. One branch followed the river, pale through the fog. The other disappeared beneath close, dark trees. Aed covered my hand and settled his thumb over my pulse. My heartbeat slowed before I could stop it. The silver ring around his pale eyes sharpened, and the same cold that had taken my knees in Bertram's chamber moved through my wrist.
Sleep. I will keep you happy now.
My eyelids sank. I hated the relief that came with it. Bertram was dead, the laughter had stopped, and no northern ironmaster would touch Aed's throat. My eyes closed. At the fork, he turned the cart toward the trees without waking me.
I hope I kept you company with my story. It would mean so much for you to like and subscribe because it helps me make more. I'll see you in the next one.